Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Everything Vaguely Paranormal. My name is Blake Smith, and my partners in the paranormal, Miss Shelley Pruitt and Mr. Ryan Roberts. How are you guys doing?
I'm ready to talk about this.
I'm ready to talk about this chick too. I know we are reeling after a 48-hour investigation over the weekend.
Oh, 110%.
Oh, I'm ready to talk about this girl.
I mean, her case is one of the most famous throughout all of history.
It is.
She has become immoral.
Immoral.
Maybe
You mean
infamous.
immortal in the history of crime.
Infamously immortal.
Yes, immortal.
Yes.
The crime was very immoral as well. It was, let's see, matricide and patricide. So yeah, that's pretty bad.
Wait, she murdered a mattress?
All right, Ryan.
I'm going to give you the definition just in case you don't know what matricide and patricide are. That's murdering your mother and your father.
So tonight we were talking about Lizzie Borden.
She took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks.
It's the lights. The lights have come on.
The light came on, and now I'm stupid.
Really
Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks, and when she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. That is actually not the correct amount of whacks.
That is not.
No, it is not.
No, that is not. Actually, there was only 29 between the two of them. However, let's go ahead and delve right into this freaking case. So, for those who don't know, we are going to be talking about the Borden murders, and this is going to be the disclaimer at the very beginning because we have some pictures of the crime scene. We have pictures of the aftermath, all of that stuff. They are quite gruesome. So, yeah, that's going to be your one and only disclaimer at this point. So if you got a weak stomach, I'm sorry. So the Borden murders is a 130-year-old basically cold case. It's still unsolved to this day.
Unsolved.
Unsolved. We'll get to that.
It is still unsolved.
It really is. It is.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
And this case has garnered a lot of attention throughout all the years. It's not really, I mean, yes, it's the fact that it was a double murder. Yes. And by an axe. But, murders happen, unfortunately, almost daily. But it's the fact that it's still unknown who committed the murders because they still have not found a murder weapon, which they're not going to because it's 130 years later. Let's just be honest. But I think it also has its fascination because of who is at the center of it. It is a woman in the late 1800s who is considered to be Christianly. Now I can't talk. Godly. Pious.
Okay.
I'm going to use a big
word.
Pious.
Something about the light being on. Like we were talking about this a little while ago. And we had no problems. The light comes on. We go live, and suddenly it's like.
I know. It's like we just lose all form of
Okay,
thought.
so let's reset. We are talking about the Lizzie Borden murders that happened in Fall River.
Yes.
And it's very interesting because Lizzie Borden, number one, like Blake said, she was a female. Female murderers were relatively unknown and unheard of. And y'all, this was a small town. And the Borden family, they were very wealthy and they owned most of Fall River.
They owned a lot of it.
Yeah, they owned a lot of it. And Lizzie Borden's trial was known at that time as the trial of the century.
Yes, it was.
So Blake's going to tell you about Lizzie Borden and what she may or may not do. Playing the part of the prosecutor is Blake Smith. Playing the part of the defense attorney is me. Ryan, you get to be the judge. The patrons are the jury.
God.
The viewers are the jury.
I hope you have your popcorn and drink ready, Ryan, because I just have a feeling.
I came ready. Front and back, baby. I'm going to get my client off.
That sounds dirty.
That did sound dirty. I apologize.
So let's go over this cast of characters real quick. Number one, the house that it takes place in is what is obviously known today as the Lizzie Borden house. Pretty freaking haunted, by the way. But we're going to be talking about the murders for this go round. But however, this is as it stands pretty much today. This is what it looked like back in that time. So the first person that we are going to talk about is Lizzie Borden herself. So Lizzie Andrew Borden, she's born on July 19th, 1816, Fall River, Massachusetts. And she is one of two children. She's got an older sister whose name is Emma. We'll talk about her in just a little bit. At the time of the murders, Lizzie is about 32, 33 years old. I believe she's 32. She's unmarried. which in that day would make her an old maid or a
She was a
spinster.
spinster, yeah.
yes, and
Yep,
still
yep.
lived with her parents.
Yes, she did. So Lizzie is also a Sunday school teacher for children of recent immigrants. She's involved in the Christian Endeavor Society as the secretary and treasurer, and she's a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, as well as the Ladies' Fruit and Flower Mission. I wonder how you get on that. That sounds fun. Bet you deliver fruits and flowers everywhere. Go ahead.
I say
Ryan.
so. She is a very well-liked, upstanding member of society.
She is. Yes,
Okay.
she is. And obviously being associated with the Borden family too. So, however, there's this dichotomy to Lizzie because it's rumored around town that Lizzie tended to like to take things that didn't really belong to her from merchants.
She was a
without paying.
klepto?
So it has been rumored and has been said.
Interesting.
I didn't mean to pull her picture down. Sorry. And so much that her father even reached out to these local merchants and was like, hey, you spot my daughter in your store and some shit goes missing. Just let me know and send me the bill. I'll pay for it. No need to ruffle any feathers.
No need to call the law and get the cops involved. We have a good name in this town, and we'd like to keep it that way.
Yes, exactly. So second in line on this little cast of characters is Sarah Borden. Now, Sarah's maiden name is Morse, so it's Sarah Morse Borden. She is Lizzie's mother. However, she ends up passing away around the time that Lizzie is 2.5 years old. She was about 40, and you see this shift in the sisters' relationship at this point. Yes, they are sisters, but the Emma, being 14 years older, takes on this motherly role to help care for Lizzie because her mother asked her, hey, please watch after Lizzie as she's growing up. So you have this 10-year age gap in between these sisters. Now, their father, who is Andrew Borden. Now, this is one of the victims of the Borden murders. Lizzie's father, Andrew, is part of the Borden family, as we've already talked about, who was one of the founding families of Fall River. So there's like no shortage of money to go around. This man invested in a lot of stuff. A lot of his relatives lived in this place in Fall River that was known as, quote, the Hill, which was this like, I don't know. Think of like the Highland Park area in Dallas. The elaborate homes, the mansions, they had all the modern technology, indoor plumbing, electricity, all that stuff at the time. So they, however, lived on the other side of town. They lived among the shops and the restaurants and the
working class.
The working class.
Andrew Borden and Lizzie Borden and Emma all lived on 2nd Street, which was kind of in a rougher area of town. And it's one of those places you kind of didn't go into after dark because there was a lot of drunks and a lot of prostitutes hanging out. And this is where they lived. And Andrew Borden made his money making furniture and coffins.
He sure did. He would eventually go on to invest in certain different mills and such, and also as well as being a landlord too on some things is how he also made his money. So
allegedly a slumlord a little bit.
Allegedly. However, the sisters were a little bit worse than he was. So he ends up remarrying Abby Borden about 2 years or so after Sarah Borden dies. Now, Abby Borden, she was 37 at the time, and she herself was considered an old maid. Andrew was about 43 whenever they married. And now it's said that Abby desired respect and social status, but was often regarded as the daughter of a pushcart peddler. And rumor was that Andrew was really just kind of looking for a housekeeper and someone to help take care of his daughters at this time. So that's why they ended up marrying, supposedly. I'm not going to put that down as fact.
Sounds like below his station in life.
Yes, she was. She was below his station for sure. What were you going to say, Ryan?
It sounds like a love-filled home.
Yes. But needless to say all that, others just thought it was kind of this strange match. And so Andrew would end up taking this newfound family with Abby and the girls from this meager livelihood to one of great wealth for the time. He really didn't want to follow in his father's footsteps, who was a fishmonger, so to speak. I mean, he sold fish on the street. that's where the break was in the Bordens. It was like his father and the rest of the Bordens. The rest of the Bordens were all affluent and stuff. But anyways, I digress. We get the point. So, as Shelley already said, I'm not going to reiterate. He started as a carpenter. He started making caskets, all of that stuff. He started building this wealth, and he used a lot of the wealth from the businesses to purchase up different pieces of property for development. So that's what ended up getting him into being a landlord. He also ended up serving on a bunch of other different boards and blah, blah, blah. He made his wealth. We'll just get down to it. At the time of his death, he was estimated to be around about $500,000, or it's about roughly 16 million in today's time.
Damn.
Yes. However, even with all that, he was also known for his frugality. The house that they lived in did not have electricity in it. It did not have gas lines that they could use to run the lamps in the house. They still used well oil lamps at this point in this house. They didn't have indoor plumbing. They actually had a double-seater latrine in the cellar. And this bothered Lizzie. Lizzie hated this. Lizzie wanted to be on the hill. She wanted to be up with her well-to-do family members. But Andrew Borden never moved them there.
I guess his motto is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess. So.
I guess so. Now, there were speculations that he was making improvements to the house to get them up to the hill, but as I said, it never happened. Now, the house that they lived in was interesting as well, and I think it needs to be noted because there were no, other than the upstairs hallway, there were no, the upstairs landing, there were no hallways in this house. You had to walk through one room to get into another room.
The house was only about 20 feet wide, I believe was what the specs on the original house were. It was only like 20 feet wide. And it was just room with a divider, room with a divider, room with a divider, and then the upstairs, which had a small hallway in it. So this is a tiny, it's not that big, not width-wise. So
no, it's not very big at all. And the fact that you had to walk through one room and into another, this leads to locks being used later on throughout the house on different doors and all this stuff, which is a big point in the trial that's yet to come.
So there's no hallways and there's no privacy.
No,
not downstairs. There's
Matter
no
of fact,
privacy.
This is the floor plan for the first floor. And as you can tell, there's no hallway. You got to walk through one room to get to the next. And the floor plan for the second floor that's the stairs that's there on the right.
That is such an odd floor plan.
It really is. It really is.
Yeah.
But anyways, so you have the other sister in this is Emma Borden. Now, as I said, Emma was the oldest of Andrew and Sarah Borden. And there was a daughter that was in between Emma and Lizzie. That's why there's such an age gap. Her name was Alice, but she ended up dying around the age of 2, I believe. Now, very little is actually known of Emma Borden. There's no records really of her education, like her love life, and there's really even less pictures of her. But this is one of Emma Borden herself.
We do know that she did eventually marry, correct, and moved to New Jersey.
I don't get me quoted on exactly where she moved. I know in 1905 the sisters had a falling out. She ended up moving out of the house and away from Lizzie, and the sisters never spoke to each other again after that falling out. However, she never really appeared to be unhappy in life. It's just that there's not much known about her. So, looking at the Borden family dynamic, there's a little bit of friction within the family itself during the time leading up to the murders. Lizzie, during the trial, speaks of Abby Borden as a mother to her. And that is actually a huge point that is questioned in the trial. Because there are others who say, no, that's not quite the case. And she's actually interviewed by police after the murders take place and they're there. And the police officer, the deputy marshal interviewing her says, well, your mother, she goes, no, she's not my mother. She makes a point to put that out. So there's a little bit of friction of that right there. She always referred to her as Mrs. Borden or Abby Borden, one of the two. She never called her mother. However, she goes on to tell it, oh, no, we loved each other. We were very close. But there are multiple people who state, no, there was some friction there with the relationship.
Are you coming to the part about why there was friction?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I won't jump your story then.
It's okay. she ends up basically saying, that's actually what I was going to talk about. That number one, it is rumored that Lizzie said that Mrs. Borden was after Mr. Borden's wealth. Number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, there is a moment in the family history where Abby's sister or sister-in-law, one of the two, I can't remember off the top of my head, her husband ends up dying. She's racked with this big old freaking mortgage, and Mr. Borden ends up fronting the money for this house to buy this house so that Abby's sister can stay in this house. And it was around that time that Lizzie was like, what the hell? Like, we're his daughters and we don't even get that crap. So what he ended up doing, Mr. Borden ended up doing, was buying what they refer to as grandfather's house, selling it to the girls for a very minimal, I think it was like $1 or something like that. It was something stupid. So that they themselves could be landlords to help build their wealth. And it wasn't but like maybe a month before the murders that they ended up selling the house back to him at $5,000. So they ended up making a shit ton of money. That's like $151,000 or something like that in today's time, and they bought it for only like $30 in today's times. I mean, like, huge.
Shit, I'm looking for that kind of investment.
You ain't lying. So there's also, I'm giving you the just kind of the dynamic at this time leading up to the murders. Around I believe it's 1890 or so, 1891. There's this daytime robbery that takes place in the house where jewelry, kind of cash stuff goes missing, and it's really no secret in the family that Lizzie is their prime suspect.
Captain Klepto probably did it.
So it's really no secret that she was the one that did it. And it's after that moment that there are locks that are put on the doors.
But
and
it wasn't proven that she did it because they didn't find the jewelry in her room. So jewelry was missing, $50, and streetcar tickets were also missing. Tickets to go and ride the trolley.
You can kind of put two and two together, though. I mean, if someone in the family is known,
because it happened when Abby and Andrew Borden were out of town.
Yeah.
And come on, I mean, they lived in a bad part of town where the drunks and the prostitutes roamed around all the time. And so you can't say it was her. Nobody ever said it was her. So you're assuming you know the answer to who did it, but you don't, sir. Please do not assume unless you have proof. You can't accuse her.
I'm just saying we have.
And the defense rests.
I'm just saying we have someone
no
who's known.
That, sir, that's hearsay.
Someone who's known.
If you aren't going to be a good judge, we're going to remove you from the bench.
Shit, I like to see you try.
Toss your ass out there.
Okay.
It was alleged that Lizzie had done it, but no proof was ever found because the jewelry and the money were not found in her possession.
Well, and there was also I found multiple sources that said that there were family members that believed that she allegedly did it. Yes. So she was suspected of being the one behind it. So there is this point in this whole saga of friction. Let me get my words right. The saga of friction that I'm going to touch on. I don't really think it has anything to do with the case or anything like that. I think it's just hearsay. Honestly, I think it's the rumor mill working at its best. Allegedly, Mr. Borden ended up at some point slaughtering some pigeons that Lizzie had been basically building their home, if you will, in the lofts of the barn, giving them a place to roost. And it's alleged that he went out there and he decapitated the birds with the same hatchet that was used against him. In my point, I think it's a moot point. There's other urban legend as well. Yeah. I think that there's other sources that even state that sometimes they even ate pigeon, like at the dinner table. So
you gotta remember, pigeon was.
It was a delicacy at the time.
That was something that was eaten. So, but also on the other thing was that. So I think. Some parts Andrew Borden kind of gets a bad rap because after all the deal with the houses and everything, he actually, because Lizzie was so upset about it, he wanted to make Lizzie feel better. He sent her, he gave her a gift and sent her to Europe to go and tour around with the fancy Bordens, her cousins. So it wasn't like, he didn't see that she was upset and he didn't want to make her feel better. That seems out of character. Now he was known as being very gruff and very spoke his mind. It was pretty harsh, but it's not like he didn't want his daughters to be happy.
Right.
I just imagine the fancy Bordens just being like, Martha, Lizzie's coming, hide the silverware.
Well, that's kind of the way they're described as the fancy Bordens that lived on the hill, and then there was Andrew's family.
Andrew's family. Yeah. And that all started with Andrew's father of this whole splitting and anyways. So that's kind of the family dynamic of kind of what's happening leading up to the murders in 18.
I'm taking
Shelley and them fucking papers. God damn it.
I'm ready for you, baby.
So now we have kind of this list of supporting characters, if you will, that we're going to kind of talk about. And one of them, first one that is going to be is John Morse, John Vinicum Morse. Now, John Morse is the brother of the late Sarah Borden. He's 59 at the time of the murders. He did not live in town. He had traveled east. That's where he had spent most of his time. But he was present and in town, staying with the Bordens the morning that both Mr. and Mrs. Borden were killed. And I believe, if I remember reading correctly, he was a business partner of Mr. Borden's to some extent. Like they had done. Go ahead, Shelley.
Oh, I was going to say, and a bit of a contentious business partner at the moment that he had arrived in town.
Want to expand? Because I didn't find that. Go ahead.
Allegedly, he and his brother-in-law were arguing over some cattle and a cattle dispute.
I did find this. Never
You
mind.
did.
Sorry.
You did know this, and there was some dispute as to who owed what money for feed and that kind of thing, and who was owed what portion of the sale of the animals, and whose animals were actually sold. So there was a bit of dispute, and it's alleged that is why John Morse came to town, was to get it all ironed out.
How convenient.
Yeah. That's interesting.
That is pretty interesting. Now, the next one that I like to talk about is Miss Bridget Sullivan. Now, Bridget Sullivan was an Irish immigrant who took on a job as basically a maid, or what would have been a servant back then for the Bordens around 1889. This is a time, I will say, when tensions within the community and the Irish were growing, especially towards immigrants. Nativism was running rampant. Let's
Absolutely,
just say the issue between native born and non-native born or immigrant. Words are hard tonight. I'm sorry.
Like if you've ever seen Gangs of New York, this is around that same time, and that's kind of the sentiment that's going around at the time.
Yes. And so Bridget was referred to as Maggie by the Bordens because which was a former maid. So you see some of the sentiment about maybe how they felt about Bridget.
Yeah, Lizzie and her sister Emma, because their previous housekeeper's name was Maggie. Whenever they hired Bridget to replace her, they didn't even bother to learn her name. They just called her Maggie as well, because Maggie was the name of the other one. So Maggie is your name as well. So these were two little rich but spoiled girls. Even though they might not have lived on the upper side of town, they acted like they lived on the upper side of town. Like I said, they didn't even call her Bridget. They called her Maggie. Yeah. Didn't even bother to learn the woman's name. Don't you think that pissed you off? These two little a-holes keep calling you, hi, my name's Shelley. No, you're Maggie. No, let me tell you what my name is.
This is why Shelley would have been fired day one.
Shelley would have drugged through the town square and been called a witch, I guarantee you.
So true. And her duties in the Borden home were cooking, cleaning, ironing, washing, and sweeping. She did not care for the bedrooms because that was usually Mrs. Borden's job to do all of that kind of stuff. And Mrs. Borden was also, from what I understand, from what I've read, a little bit, I don't know, I would almost label this like OCD about her bedrooms and the way that they were from just the inferences of the different articles that I read. However, Bridget, I almost called her Maggie. Jesus.
Easy there, Lizzie.
I know, right? Bridget lived on the third floor, which was right over Mr. Borden's bedroom. And Mr. Borden's bedroom was it's Mrs. Borden's bedroom that was directly over the kitchen. Now, at the time, Bridget was the only domestic servant in the house, but she did talk about a man named Alfred, which was a man that came and did the chores on the farm. That was the only two people other than the Bordens who were there at the household on the regular. And her testimony in the trial doesn't, I don't know, it's full of this vital information into the inquest of the Borden murders. However, really didn't hurt nor help Lizzie, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Let's
I
go
mean,
ahead and get to the
it's
murders, then we'll start talking
okay.
about the
Fine.
trial.
All
But you
right,
have to
fine.
remember too that where Bridget was placed was technically the attic.
Right.
She
Yeah.
basically lived in the attic. Can you
Right.
imagine how hot and how cold that was? You know, during the year.
No electricity, no gas lines.
Yeah.
Frugal son of a bitch.
hmm
Mhm.
So not only did they call her Maggie instead of Bridget, they also put her up in the attic to live.
Yeah.
That's-
So
I was gonna say that. I mean, that's unfortunately how they did those people back then, and she was one of the ones that had it good, because if you ever
She had a
saw
bed.
some of the places that a lot of the immigrants were living, not a good place to be.
very true. So we're just quickly run down. There's like about 3 or 4 more little supporting characters in this whole trial and murder and all this kind of stuff. You have Adelaide Churchill. Adelaide was a neighbor to the Bordens, who, along with Bridget, is the one that discovered Mrs. Borden's body. You have Dr. Seabury Bowen, who is the family physician. And you have Alice Manley Russell, who is a friend of Emma and Lizzie. And you have Eli Bentz, who is a clerk at a drugstore that'll come into play later on. And then also, obviously, you have a host of policemen and lawyers and all that kind of stuff. So we all get to the murders. I just had to set the scene a little bit for you of who we all going to be talking about. So we're going to talk about August of 1892. And on August 2nd of 1892, which is 2 days prior to the murder, both Andrew and Abby Borden woke up complaining of stomach pains. And this is kind of the first time some things, in my opinion, don't really add up in the timeline. But we'll get back on that in a little bit. Mrs. Borden is concerned about, basically, she's like, I need to go see the doctor. She thinks they're being poisoned. Like, she actually goes and tells the doctor, hey, I think that I'm being poisoned. The doctor's kind of like, I don't think you're being poisoned. She tells him that Mr. Borden is like, he's sick at home and all this stuff. He's got the same issues I do. He refuses to come here. He refused. This is how frugal he is. He says, I refuse to pay a doctor over an upset stomach. Like, he did not want to. So she goes off to his house, ends up bringing the doctor back. And there's this huge, like, kind of blow up between Mr. Borden and the doctor. And he orders him out of the house.
Do we know if the maid did the cooking in the home?
She did. She did.
Okay. I mean,
and
that's kind of odd that they're all complaining of stomach pains 2 days beforehand, and they treat the maid very poorly. So that's a little weird.
Lizzie and Emma also were complaining of stomach pains. However, that they were asked, Mrs. Borden was asked, well, what have you eaten? Now, being that Mr. Borden was extremely frugal, nothing went to waste in the house. They had been eating allegedly the same mutton and broth for 4 days.
Oh, God.
Do you think he had anything like a refrigerator or anything
hell
like that
no.
in there? I'm sure that ice cost money and you had to have a box to put it in. Do you think that it was refrigerated? So it is possible that because the meat could have been going bad, that could have been the reason for them having stomach issues.
Now, here's my only thing with this, though, is because a bunch of articles and the trial and the testimony and all that stuff that I read through, Lizzie claims that she was having stomach issues as well. And Mrs. Borden also claims that Lizzie was having stomach issues. However, there is nobody that I was able to find that was actually able to lay eyes on Lizzie sick. Lizzie states that she was vomiting, as was everybody else. But there is actually where it's Mr. Borden, Mrs. Borden are heard vomiting. Bridget claims that she vomited outside. Lizzie's like, yeah, I was sick myself as well. But when they start asking around, it's Mrs. Borden who's doing the relaying of information, going, yes, Lizzie's sick. She doesn't feel well. Nobody actually that I was able to find saw her with their own eyes sick.
You ever gone to work and not feel good? Did anybody ever see you sick?
Oh God, Pete, you can
tell.
I'm a horrible subject on because you can totally tell when I'm sick. I got man cold syndrome.
But Mrs. Borden, who did act in the capacity as a mother figure and caregiver, said that Lizzie was sick. So, and I mean, I have not felt good, and nobody's really known I didn't feel good, but I just didn't feel good. So I think that just because nobody else said she was sick, you got to remember, Lizzie very rarely ever left her house. Her social outlets were the church, the Women's Flower Club, and the temperance thing where she was against the drinking and all that kind of stuff. And so those were her social outlets. And that she really didn't leave the house. She didn't have money to shop. She was given this paltry little allowance for enough to buy 2 dresses a year. 2. That's how much money her father allotted her on dresses. So she didn't really. While they had money, she didn't have. Her father was rich. She was not.
She wasn't rich. Yeah.
So she really didn't have much of a social life. So her not going out and not being seen sick, not a factor.
Okay. I'm just gonna say it's interesting.
Not a factor.
I'm gonna say it's interesting.
They ate bad meat. They were eating food that was rotting and spoiled. And
all right,
if they were all eating the same thing, if I consume more than you do, I'm probably going to be more ill than you are.
That's just what I expect a defense attorney to say. Not a factor.
But it's not unlogical, and it's not.
No, it's not illogical. I'm just going to chalk it up as being interesting. I'll say that.
I'll give you interesting, but not impossible.
Who's the judge here?
Not you anymore. You've been
tossed off the bench.
Oh, so just because you don't like what I got to say, now I'm not the judge.
If you followed a logical reasoning, I would.
That's what I'm saying. I'm just going to say interesting here. I'm going to say interesting.
We'll go with interesting.
So
go ahead,
judge,
Blake. Continue on with he's appointing himself. Continue on with your fabulous story.
Interestingly enough, since y'all threw out the word interesting like 800 times, interestingly enough, on August the 3rd, which is the day before the murders, Lizzie Borden is said to have attempted to go into a local drugstore, which is where Eli Benz comes into play, in an attempt to buy, I can't ever say it, Prussic?
How's it spelled?
Prussic.
I'm going to say Prussic. Yeah,
Prussic.
I think it's Prussic.
Yes.
I think it's Prussic.
Prilosec OTC.
I have to see if it's on the front or the back of my notes.
The Prilosec OCT, yes.
Yeah.
Obviously, which is poisonous. And her reason for it was because she needed to clean a sealskin that she had. The purchase was denied. And Lizzie actually goes on to say that she actually has no idea like where the drugstore was, despite basically being a block from the house. And that kind of ties into the family being sick and all this kind of stuff. But later on, it's chalked up to mistaken identity.
But here's the thing, that the druggist said that he did not sell it to her. So he didn't. Non-factor, and he was willing to testify that he did not sell it to her. She needed to clean a stain on her sealskin coat, and he wouldn't sell it to her because that's the same thing that was like used in like things that you clean drains and things with. This was a very serious acid, and it was extremely poisonous if ingested. And again, he said he never sold it to her, so that's not even an issue. She never had it.
Well, I know, but it could be if you look at somebody who may or may not have been sick, interesting, from that point of view, who may have been trying to poison somebody and it didn't work the way that she thought. Oh, all of a sudden I need to go try and get something stronger. That's where I'm coming from.
You're assuming. There are no facts to back that up.
It's interesting. I'll say that.
That's going to be Ryan's answers for everything. It's interesting.
Not necessarily. I'll just say it's interesting.
There are no facts to back that up, so continue on.
So this very same night is when John Vinicum Morse comes into town, and he ends up staying with the Bordens. He states that upon his arrival, he saw Mr. and Mrs. Borden and Bridget, but not Lizzie. He had dinner when he arrived, and they had, as the family had finished already. And between 3 and 4 that afternoon, he goes into town. He returns to the house between 8:30 and 8:45. He rings the doorbell. Mrs. Borden lets him in, and there's no sign of Lizzie still. This is all through kind of his testimony. They sat in the living room for a little while until a few minutes past 10 when Mrs. Borden retired to her bedroom, and he and Mr. Borden were soon to follow. Now, prior to going to bed, he saw someone come into the house and go to Lizzie's room and shut the door, but he actually never saw if it was Lizzie or not. Now, we know from later on Lizzie's story that it was her that came through the door because she's the one who says about the time she got home. So on that same night, though, on August the 3rd, According to the friend and next door neighbor, Alice Russell, Lizzie ended up paying her a visit. And the visit, she said, was kind of odd. According to Alice Russell's testimony, Lizzie stated, I'm going to share with you the conversation that is in the testimony that I found. Lizzie, sometimes I think our milk might be poisoned. Alice, well, how do you get your milk? How could it be poisoned? Lizzie, we have the milk come in a can set on the step, and we have an empty can. We put out the can overnight, and the next morning when they bring the milk, they take the empty can. Alice, if they put anything in the can, the farmer would see it. After asking what time the milk came, Lizzie responded, I think about 4:00. Alice, well, it is light at 4. I shouldn't think anybody would dare come then and tamper with the cans for fear somebody would see them. Lizzie, I shouldn't think so. Now, in reference to the Bordens being sick, this is all in the same conversation. It's just the whole thing's not there, so I'm kind of tying it together for you. In reference to the Bordens being sick, Lizzie states, quote, they were awfully sick, and I wasn't sick. I didn't vomit, but I heard them vomiting, stepped to the door and asked if I could do anything, and they said no. When asked who would want to do that, Lizzie responded, I don't know. I feel afraid sometimes that Father has got an enemy, for he has so much trouble with the men that come to see him. Now, Lizzie described a man that came to see Mr. Borden and heard her father say, quote, I don't care to let my property for such business. This man was coming to try and rent out a piece of property. And the man says, I shouldn't think that you would care what you let your property for. And Lizzie states, Father was mad and ordered him out of the house. Now, during all this conversation, Alice states Lizzie told her of seeing the man around the house one night when she went home. And Lizzie says in this conversation, quote, and you know the barn has been broken into twice. Alice, oh, well, you know well that that was somebody after the pigeons. There is nothing in there for them to go after but the pigeons. And Lizzie says, well, they have broken into the house in broad daylight with Emma and Maggie or Bridget and me there. Alice says, I've never heard that before. And Lizzie says, Father forbade our telling of it. So when asked further about it, Lizzie stated that it was in Mrs. Borden's dressing room. The room had been ransacked and they took a watch, chain, money, and streetcar tickets, among other things. This is the daytime robbery that we referenced earlier. And Lizzie says, quote, I feel as if I wanted to sleep with my eyes half open, with one eye open half the time, for fear they will burn the house down over us. I'm afraid somebody will do something. I don't know, but I don't know what somebody will do. I think sometimes I'm afraid sometimes that somebody will do something to him. He is so discourteous to that word to people, mean, rude, to change it up. So this is the conversation that's taking place from Alice's testimony the previous night prior to the murders. And she just found it extremely odd that here she is talking about being poisoned, that something's going to end up happening to her father.
Well, first of all, they'd already been talking about being poisoned, and Alice was one of her good friends. So, if we were talking about something and I'd be like, everybody's been sick, I wasn't sick the other day, but, I've been sick and, I don't know, my dad's pissing off everybody in town, and he did have enemies everywhere. He was a very gruff, very frugal, he paid his bills, but he always did it with a snarl, and he wasn't well liked. And as far as the milk goes, if it sits out at 4:00 in the afternoon, you got to remember unpasteurized milk. That means if it sits in the sun, it's going bad fast.
Yeah.
So they could have gotten some bad milk at some point, not out of the realm of possibility. Again, she's talking about this break-in to the house, and there actually is some report that I read that said that the screen door at the back actually appeared to have been forced open. Now, there would not have been any reason for Lizzie or Bridget or Mrs. Borden or Mr. Borden to force that door, or Emma. So on the day of that robbery, there actually was evidence that the screen door had been forced. So again, we're already talking about being poisoned. That I can see that being on the mind. That is something that is already going through the house. We know Mr. Borden has lots of enemies. So I think Alice is just telling a tale of what they were talking about. It's hearsay.
But she's talking about her parents dying, and then all of a sudden the next morning,
dead.
No,
that's
she's
pretty
afraid that something is going to happen to them because she's already been afraid.
Hold on, no. I have to sleep with my eyes half open for fear that somebody's going to burn the house down. In other words, for fear that somebody's going to make an attempt on my life, our lives. So she's
But she
talking
does
about
include
people
herself in that.
dying. Right,
But
but
she
she's
does
talking,
include herself in that.
which includes her parents. But we're talking about, she's talking about her parents dying, and all of a sudden, what, 12 hours later, they're dead?
Yeah.
So let me ask you something. Do you think Lizzie Borden was a stupid woman?
No.
Okay. No further questions.
I don't know. It seems like she's planting that seed that something weird's going on and she could be innocent.
Now, Ryan, you're
I
not
don't know.
coming at this from a point of unbiasedness. You're coming at a point from you already think she's guilty and you're looking for things to support you.
Not
Now,
necessarily.
let's look at it.
Hold on a second. Not necessarily.
We still got to get through the murders. We're there. We're
I
at the
just-
next morning.
I just think that it's odd. I think that it's very odd that she just happens to bring this up to her friend the night before it all happens.
And so we've gone to a ghost hunt and we've been like, man, I feel like something's going to pop up. Then something pops off. Did you premeditate that? Just because you
That
talked
is
about it?
way different.
Why not? We're
Yeah.
talking
That is-
about
that is
something
apples
Because
and
you're
oranges.
talking
You're
about
talking
something
about
you have
something
control
before it
over
happens.
versus something you don't have control over.
No.
But you're talking about something prior to it happening. Whether it happens or not, you are
It's-
talking about something prior to it happening. But she included herself.
It's
She
premeditated
included
murder.
This
But
premeditated
she
murder and
included
two.
herself as a victim whenever she's,
Well, yeah,
she's afraid
she's
the house
not.
is going to
You
burn down.
just okay. I'm sorry.
She doesn't
but-
say. She doesn't
she-
say.
She
I'm afraid
doesn't.
we're all going to get hatchet burned. She says, "I'm afraid that somebody's going to
She-
burn the house down because everybody hates my father."
She doesn't, but it just seems like she's kind of telegraphing a little bit. Like, well, it'd be weird if something happened. That's all I'm saying. It's
Again,
a little
do you
odd.
think Lizzie Borden was a stupid woman?
I don't know. I didn't know.
No,
her.
which is why I think that she's including herself in this story to make it a cover to cover up the tracks. Of,
She's already
I'm
attempting.
fearful of our lives. I've got to throw myself into it
She's-
so it doesn't seem too suspicious that I'm just talking about my parents'
Exactly.
murder because boom, they wind up dead the next day.
It sounds
No,
like
I
she's
don't
just throwing
think
a
she was
line out
stupid.
there.
I don't
Like,
think she
just-
was stupid.
yeah.
I think she was covering her tracks. It's my opinion.
It
However-
just seems it's odd. It seems like she's kind of throwing a line out there to see how it will be perceived.
Yes, that's the way that I get it.
That's just what it seems like.
Yeah.
Continue.
Okay, let me get. All right, so we're gonna walk through the days of the murder, the morning of the murders, and I've got my notes here on this timeline based on all different kinds of testimony that I
It's fucking nuts.
don't want to get this wrong. So this is the day of the murders. This is on August 4th of 1892. John Morse rises at 6 a.m. and he met Mr. and Mrs. Borden in the dining room for breakfast at 7 a.m. After breakfast, Morse and Mr. Borden go into the dining room while Mrs. Borden begins her household duties, and Bridget cleans the table and begins hers as well. Morse left the house around 8:48 a.m. through the screen rear door. Now, it's said in testimony that Mr. Borden hooked the back door when Morse left out through it. Morse went to go buy a pair of oxen and visit his niece in Fall River to return to the Borden's house by noon for lunch. Around 9 a.m., Mr. Borden goes for his walk throughout town and to send mail for Lizzie. And also around 9 a.m., Bridget goes to the backyard to throw up because she's having stomach issues. Now, she says when she goes back inside after about 10-15 minutes, she locks the screen door. And Mrs. Borden tells her she wants some windows washed. And she said in every window she washed, she saw no one in the room. And she finished the washing, and I'm big time paraphrasing because this went on forever. She finished the washing and she ends up going back inside. Now, Bridget hears somebody at the front door trying to get in, so she went to go see who it was, and it was Mr. Borden, so she let him back inside through the front door, and this is a couple of hours later. We're around maybe about 10:45, 10:50, close to 11. Bridget is asked by Lizzie she's going to go out to town, and Bridget says she doesn't know, to which Lizzie tells her, if you do, lock the screen doors. Mrs. Borden is off visiting a sick friend, which came from a note that Mrs. Borden received from someone that morning. But Bridget says she never saw anyone deliver a note while she was washing the windows. So Bridget says she retires up to her room after completing the inside windows. And she said she didn't remember hearing anyone about the house except for those that she had named in her statement. She lays down in bed. She hears the city town hall clock strike 11 a.m., but no other noise. And she's adamant that she did not hear the screen door, which she could hear from her room. She said she hadn't taken off her shoes or clothes or anything like that. And it had to be about 10-15 minutes later when she heard Lizzie scream, "Maggie, come down quick, father's dead." Bridget rushes down the stairs and was told to go get help and not go into the room that Mr. Borden was found in. Bridget immediately rushes over to Dr. Bowen's house, but he wasn't home, so he came back, and Lizzie instructed her to go to the neighbor's house to get some help, which was Adelaide Churchill. Adelaide Churchill returns to the Borden home after being summoned by Bridget, and then there's dozens of police officers that storm the Borden house as well shortly thereafter. And it wasn't until basically Bridget and Adelaide Churchill go up the stairs that they then discover Mrs. Borden's body on the floor as well. A post-mortem was immediately done on the dining room table in the house, and all of those that were present were immediately questioned about their whereabouts during the day. Now, between Mr. and Mrs. Borden, 29 strikes were recorded. And disclaimer again, this is where some stuff's going to get gruesome in pictures. 29 strikes were recorded, and it's safe to say, based on the autopsy, that Mr. Borden received 10 out of those 29, but his face was so disfigured that the report only numbers 8 of them. All strikes were to the left side of the face.
Ah, damn.
And one was so deep that it pierced the brain and left his left eye dangling.
Oh my God.
And this is actually what his skull looked like afterwards.
Good Lord.
Yeah. I mean, he was brutalized.
Absolutely.
So Mrs. Borden was struck on the side of the head, on the left side. And I think it needs to be noted here that there's bruising on her forehead and on the bridge of her nose, which basically says, if you look at forensics and stuff like that and autopsies, for bruising to form, you have to be alive. So that tells me that Mrs. Borden was probably doing something, turned, saw her attacker, was struck on the side of the head because it's the only one. She spun around, went face first into the ground, hitting her nose and her forehead, causing the bruise. The remaining 18 blows were to the back of her head.
God almighty, just pulverized her skull.
Basically, yes.
God, no.
And this is actually her corpse afterwards.
Good Lord.
As well as her skull.
Good God.
And what was interesting, though, with the police and the autopsy is that it was stated that Mr. Borden's body was warm to the touch, but Mrs. Borden's wasn't. And police based her time of death 90 minutes prior to Mr. Borden's death, or at approximately 9:30 in the morning. So that's the interview when Lizzie is interviewed, that basically she says, no, she's not my mother, all that kind of stuff. So initial speculation of the murder first centered on a Portuguese laborer who had visited the Borden home earlier in the morning and asked for wages due to him, only to be told by Mr. Borden that he had no money and to call later. Added to this was the fact that papers reported Mrs. Borden to have been killed by, quote, a tall man who struck the woman from behind. And of course, we've already talked about the one blow to the side of the head. It's not taking into account to that. They're thinking she's attacked from behind and hit repeatedly over and over. So it would have to have been a tall man to get the blows that she got. It's not until a couple of days later that the newspapers actually begin to report that possibly 32-year-old little Lizzie Borden could have something to do with the murder of her parents. And that's when it's aided by the drugstore clerk, who basically says, yeah, I saw her come in. She tried to buy acid, I like Shelley's intimidation factor by swiping through notes and flipping pages while I'm talking about all of it.
I'm listening and I'm marking what I know you've already said, and I'm putting a circle around things I want to come back to.
Just kidding. I had to give you shit. But anyway, so police came to the conclusion that the murders must have taken place by someone inside the Borden home. However, they were puzzled by the lack of blood anywhere except on the bodies of the victims and their inability to uncover any type of murder weapon. And Lizzie's sister, Emma, was also out of town at this time, so suspicion towards Lizzie only grew. And of course, when she started making all this contradicting statements, that didn't help either. They found it odd that Lizzie had no known whereabouts of Abby Borden after 9 a.m. All that she told them was Mrs. Borden had gone upstairs to, quote, put shams on the pillows.
Well,
And
she said that she was in the barn finding like weights for like going on a fishing trip, right? That was her alibi, that she
did.
Okay.
For the time frame that her father was murdered.
Okay.
So it's also interesting that she says that Mrs. Borden was summoned by a note because a friend was sick, and that's why she didn't think that she was home. However, no note was ever found. And whenever the same friend, Alice Russell earlier, was like, oh, maybe she threw it in the fire and burned it. And Lizzie's like, oh, yeah, maybe she did. That's what she must have done.
Huh.
So it's just, I don't know. I know, Shelley, you were scratching and marking through. What you got to add?
Oh, I'm letting you present your timeline that I'm going to present mine.
Oh, okay. Well, let me flip the papers too. Damn it!
I'm staying with you. I'm marking what I agree with and what I don't.
This is how you know it's going to get good.
Mm-hmm.
Children.
Ooh, that's a really good point, Leanne. Thank you. I'm popping that up on the screen right now. Mr. Borden's heavy coat on the sofa? ? He was wearing a coat in August. Maybe the murderer used it. Lizzie? There's also speculation that she killed her parents while stark naked. And that's why she didn't have any blood on her. But I haven't been able to really.
That's a bit horrifying. Just
really been able to find anything further on that one. So all of this comes to basically on August the 9th, an inquest into the Borden murders was held in the courtroom over the police headquarters. And by now, the story had gained fame from the papers and the rumor mills that had been spread across the country. So during the inquest, Lizzie is not afforded any representation, and she was questioned heavily on the following: her relationship with Mr. Borden, why she stopped calling Abby Borden her mother. Her only answer was that she chose to do so due to an issue with Abby Borden's stepsister that came out over property and what Lizzie referred to as grandfather's house. That's what we already talked about, her father purchasing grandfather's house. She was questioned about Mr. Borden and Abby's relationship, Emma and Mr. Borden's relationship, what she was wearing the day of the murders, which she did say was a blue dress that she ends up handing over to police. Now, is it the one that she, wore that day? I don't know. We'll see. She's questioned about her uncle, John Morse, and his visit on the night before the murders, her whereabouts on the night before the murders, her whereabouts the day of the murder. And that is a huge point of frustration with the prosecution because she cannot land exactly where the hell she's at different times of the morning. She contradicts herself several times. One moment she's downstairs in the kitchen, she's having breakfast when her father come home. The next she's in the dining room doing the ironing. She speaks about a moment where she went upstairs, but she can never remember exactly like where she was. I'm not gonna lie. I remember texting you and I was like, this bitch's testimony is so flipping confusing.
Yeah. It's just all over the place.
It is. It makes absolutely no sense. And I know that that's a prosecutorial, I guess, game of cat and mouse that you play with the person that you're questioning, so to speak, by, asking this question and then coming back to it later on. But based on other testimony in the inquest to the murders, like Bridget Sullivan's, that is so detailed, so time-stamped about where she was, what she was doing.
Could we not chalk it up to nerves, though? I mean, she just saw it like her parents were just murdered, and she could have just gone blank and just couldn't really.
Later on, it's chalked
weave
up,
together,
Later on, it's chalked up by the doctor, saying that he gave her morphine.
Okay, well,
I get it, but
you've been in a hospital room with someone who's on morphine, and they are 10 kinds of loopy. So
yeah,
maybe.
Well, it's like Bridget Sullivan is also questioned in the inquest of the murders, and when she begins her testimony, it is very detailed account of her whereabouts, the whereabouts of others, both the night before and the day of the murders, and she includes like the detail, the work she did the day of the murders, like when she was washing the windows, all that she had experienced. Now, what I found interesting was a passage in her testimony that reads as follows, quote, this is Bridget Sullivan's testimony, quote, When I got downstairs, I saw Miss Lizzie standing with her back to the screen door. I went to go right into the sitting room, and she says, "Oh, Maggie, don't go in. I've got to have a doctor quick. Go over. I got to have the doctor." I went over to Dr. Bowen's right away. When I came back, I said, "Miss Lizzie, where was you?" I said, "I didn't I leave the screen door hooked?" She says, "I was out in the backyard and heard a groan. Came in and the screen door was wide open." She says, "Go and get Miss Russell. I can't be alone in the house." So I got a hat and a shawl and went. I had not found Dr. Bowen when I went to the house, but I told Mrs. Bowen that Mr. Borden was dead. And she goes on later on her testimony, says, "And I says, 'Oh, Lizzie, if I knew where Mrs. Whitehead,'" which is Abby's sister, "was, I would go and see if Mrs. Borden was there and tell her that Mr. Borden was very sick. She says," this is Lizzie saying this, "'Maggie, I am almost positive I heard her coming in. Why don't you go upstairs to see?' And Bridget replies, 'I am not going upstairs alone.'" And that's when Bridget and Mrs. Churchill go upstairs and discover the body of Mrs. Borden. I find that super interesting because it's kind of like, I don't know where she's at. She's gone to go visit a sick friend. Wait a minute. I thought I heard her come in. Why don't you go and see? Which one is it? Is she setting Bridget and Mrs. Churchill up to be the ones to discover her body that she knew was up there the whole time? I don't know.
It is weird. Yeah, I mean, is she? Yeah, like you're saying, is she at a friend's house or is she in the house? Which one is it? You can't, you can't be somewhere else in there at the same time.
Yeah. And so also question in all of this is her Uncle John. And he is basically asked about his stay at the Borden residence the night before the murders, as well as the screen door and the search of the Borden residence after the police arrives. There's not much testimony that he gives in his answer. Nothing that he really gives is anything that's, in my opinion, completely vital. And his testimony is like this big compared to, everybody else's.
Pages and pages worth.
Yeah. So 2 days later, Lizzie is arrested for the murder of her parents and enters into a plea of not guilty the following days and transported to the jail in Taunton, 8 miles north of Fall River. And on August 22nd, they begin her preliminary trial. And at the end of which the judge found her probably guilty and ordered her to face a grand jury. So after first refusing to issue an indictment, the jury reconvened and heard new evidence from Alice Russell, a longtime friend to Emma and Lizzie, the neighbor that I've talked about. And it's during Russell's testimony that she revealed that she, only when they're in front of the grand jury, that she revealed she had seen Lizzie burning a blue dress in a kitchen fire, allegedly, because as Lizzie had put it, it was ruined by old paint.
Was it now?
So coupling that with the earlier testimony from Bridget that Lizzie was wearing a blue dress, it was enough for the jurors to indict Lizzie on the murder of her parents. And Lizzie sits in jail for 9 months, I believe, 10 months. And her trial begins on June 5th of 1893. And basically the quick rundown of this is when the state opens their case, got all this pinpointed for me. Let me read it down for you. And then Shelley, you can destroy the shit out of it. So when the state opens their case, the skulls of Mr. and Mrs. Borden were presented as evidence in the trial. And of course, at the sight of this macabre evidence, Lizzie faints. She passes out. Now, the most important witness at the trial of Lizzie Borden was Bridget Sullivan herself, who testified that Lizzie was the only one at home at the time that her parents were murdered. But she also stated that she had not seen any signs of the rumored ugly relationship between Lizzie and her stepmother, stating, quote, "Everything was pleasant. Lizzie and her mother always spoke to each other." That's all she said. However, other prosecution witnesses disputed Sullivan's testimony. A local cloak maker spoke about a conversation with Lizzie in which she recalled Lizzie saying Mrs. Borden was, quote, "a mean good for nothing," and said, quote, "I don't have much to do with her. I stay in my room most of the time." So they talk about the stomach pains and the being poison. So Bridget Sullivan does, and she states that when she let this is all summarization of what kind of happened at the trial. Bridget states that when she let Mr. Borden back into the house through the front door, after he returned home from his walk around town that morning, she then described hearing Lizzie's cries for help a few minutes later. She wasn't sure ever if the screen latched whenever it shut if it was locked, if it caught, or any of that stuff. It never came to fruition that, oh, yes, it was 100% shut. So during all that. So what ends up happening is they go on talking about Lizzie's alibi during the time Mr. Borden and is murdered, and saying that she was in the hayloft looking for sinkers or lead sinkers to go on a fishing trip. And the police are like, dude, it was stifling hot. Nobody would stay, more than 10, 20 minutes up in there, or a few minutes, when she said she was up there 10, 20 minutes. It comes out that the doctor prescribed her morphine at that, that's why her inquest testimony was so bleh. But she actually never speaks again. Lizzie herself never actually speaks again about the murders or anything like that, because now she has representation. The only thing that's different in this one is Deputy Marshal Fleet is the one that interviewed Lizzie Borden on the day that the police came to the house. And he says that Lizzie was acting very standoffish. There was never a tear shed. It just didn't sit right with him, is basically what he was explaining.
Well, she's whacked out on morphine.
Well, no. We're talking about the day of the murders.
Oh, okay.
At the house.
Mm-hmm.
So they hear Alice Russell's testimony about the conversation that her and Lizzie had the previous nights, and further into the blue dress burning, about her saying that it was covered in paint. Now the cross-examination in the defense, I'm going to give you one, Shelley, argues to the fact that fuck off. Basically
Does this
says
have to do with Emma?
No. So sit down.
I'm waiting my turn.
Children, we're
I told y'all needed to tune in tonight. It's going to get good, because
I'm waiting my turn. But go ahead. You go ahead and see if you give me one. Go ahead. Drink it.
Anyways, the cross-examination with the defense argued that someone attempting to destroy incriminating evidence wouldn't do it so openly, is what that they were saying.
Also, the cops, when they got to the house and went through everything, were they not? I'm sure they would have searched every inch of that house to see if there was anything that would pertain to the murder. And if they had found a dress that had any stains or anything, they probably would have taken it. So, I mean, it could have actually been covered in paint.
They found one dress with a lone spot of blood on it that they chalked up to menstrual blood.
Okay.
That was on, I believe, actually the undergarment portion.
Of the dress, not the
outside of the dress, that they chalked it up to menstrual blood. So, anyways, the remainder of the trial, because I'm ready to hear Shelley's side. So the remainder of this trial basically saw the prosecution throwing up these pigeons, no pun intended, and the defense almost always successfully either wounding them or bringing them down. Here you go, Shelley. Write some more. The defense kept hammering the contradictory statements of the state's witnesses. They revealed holes in the state's case, like when they brought up the fact that the state didn't have the handle that had broken off of the axe head that they had as evidence. The state didn't have an answer about where the whereabouts of the handle were. They also exploited the state's own timeline by showing the roughly 8 to 13 minutes in between Mr. Borden being murdered and Lizzie shouting upstairs for Bridget was simply not enough time in washing blood off oneself, one's clothes, hiding the murder weapon, as well as washing the blood off the murder weapon. And the crushing moment of the trial is when the 3 panel of judges decided that Lizzie's own testimony in her inquest would not be admissible in the trial. They said that Lizzie's testimony wasn't voluntary and that she should have had counsel present. So that was completely dismissed. And the state took one more final blow when the 3 panel judges, after listening to medical experts, druggists, furriers, the chemists, about the qualities, properties, and uses of prussic acid, decided that the evidence would be excluded as well. So the state's taken some freaking hammering, and the defense also gave some witnesses who spoke about seeing a strange man around the Borden house around 11 p.m. the night before. Another witness speaks about a weird person or man around the house at 10 a.m. that morning. A plumber and a gas fitter stated that they had been in the Borden's barn loft a day or two prior to the murders, where Lizzie said she was in the roughly 10-15 minutes Mr. Borden was murdered. And that's what cast doubt on the police assertion that Lizzie's alibi was suspect due to the dust in the loft appearing undisturbed. Emma Borden ended up taking the stand, and that was like the most anticipated witness. But she spoke about the great relationship that Lizzie and Mr. Borden had, and she insisted again that the relations between Mrs. Borden and Lizzie were fine. She even admitted to having animosity towards Mrs. Borden herself over the grandfather's house thing. So what it all boils down to, summing it up for the defense, they basically come in, and this is the quote for it. They say, quote, "There is not one particle of direct evidence in this case from beginning to end against Lizzie A. Borden. There is not a spot of blood. There is not a weapon that they have connected with her in any way, shape, or fashion. They insisted the crime must have been committed by a maniac or a devil, not by someone with a respectable background of their client. They said the state failed to meet its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that it was physically impossible for Lizzie, without help, to have committed the crime within the timeline suggested by the prosecution. The defense ridiculed the theory that Lizzie might have avoided getting blood spots on her clothes by killing her parents while stark naked, and argued that the murders could have easily been done by a passerby on the street who slipped out of the house undetected. And they ended up charging the jury to bring back a plea of innocence and to take into account Lizzie's exceptional Christian character, which entitled her to every inference in her favor. The jury ended up deliberating very quickly. However, they took an hour and a half before returning with its verdict of not guilty. And she's acquitted. Now, after the trial, she goes on. Basically, she's ostracized from the community. She stays in the community. She moves up to the hill into a mansion with her sister that they named Maplecroft. And that's when I spoke of earlier that they would have a falling out in 1905, and the sisters would never speak again.
And she never married after that either, did she? She was just absolutely...
Nope.
Wow.
Lizzie ended up passing away at the age of 62 in June of 1927, and her sister Emma would pass away within 2 weeks of Lizzie as well.
9 days later.
9 days later, also in June of 1927. So I'm going to turn it over to the defense attorney, who's probably going to crush this one. Go for it.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Shelley Pruitt for the defendant, Lizzie Borden.
Shut the fuck
Let
up.
me give you a few alternatives for my client. Okay. First of all, John Morse, Lizzie's uncle, he moves back to town 1 year prior to all these murders. He comes to stay at the house the night before the murders are committed. Just giving you another suspect to think here. He and Mr. Borden had a bit of a salty relationship going on. He'd come to stay in order to iron things out. I'm going to give you reasonable doubt number one right there.
Okay.
Now, the reason why in the morning that Lizzie did not come down to eat breakfast with her stepmother, and John and Mr. Borden was because of the tension in the family. And there was tension in the family. We will thoroughly admit to that. But she wanted to avoid John. She didn't care for John either. And it was not unusual for the family at that point in time to not be eating together on a regular basis. She stayed in her room to avoid Abby and to avoid John. Now, whenever everything starts going on the timeline, where we know that John stays upstairs until about 8:45 when he leaves, he is in the guest room. Andrew leaves roughly around the same time frame. Abby goes to clean the guest bedrooms, and it's around 9:30 when she's allegedly killed. Now, around 10:40 to 10:45, as the prosecution stated, Andrew does return home early. He is feeling ill, but he's there between 10:40 and 11 a.m. And he allegedly takes a nap on the couch where he is murdered. So here's what happens between then. Let me give you this timeline, okay?
The fucking turning of the pages.
I know.
Is she licking her finger before she does it?
You're right.
All right. First thing that is unusual about this day, other than the fact that the brother-in-law stays, which he really didn't have to. Emma, who didn't travel much. Emma was a homebody.
Mm-hmm.
Emma just happens to be traveling and to be away on the day of the murders. Now, whenever Let's see. Hang on. I'm sorry. I lost my place. Da-da-da-da. There we go. I've got it. I have so many to read. I'm flipping pages. I'm trying to catch up where I am. Now, whenever Mr. Borden arrives home, it is true that the door is locked because Bridget does testify that there is banging on the door. And Bridget goes to unlock the door for Mr. Borden. And for some reason, the locks won't work. Mr. Borden is angry. He continues to bang on the door. And Bridget does see Lizzie turn around to be standing on the landing, laughing at the fact that Bridget can't get the door open. So once the door's open and Mr. Borden is let in, he goes to his bedroom for a brief amount of time and then goes back downstairs to the parlor. Bridget, who was supposed to be washing the windows, she again is not feeling well. She was also told to wash the outside windows. She asked if instead of washing them right now, can she please go and take a nap? They say, okay. So she retires to the 3rd floor to take a nap. Now, this is all past the time that Mrs. Borden has been allegedly murdered. Now, 2 people have entered the house. Lizzie says that she was in the barn eating pears and looking for bits of lead to make lead weights for fishing, which she did have a trip scheduled to go fishing. This still fits. So when she goes back in, she calls for Bridget because she discovers her father has been murdered. She sends Bridget to go and get the doctor. However, the doctor is not home. The doctor is out on a house call. So there's a delay in time. So then she sends Bridget to get Alice Russell, who is the best friend. Now, at this point, with all the screaming and all the hullabaloo, neighbors begin to gather around the house. There's about 20 people at this point. They're hearing these yelling. They're hearing everything. And a neighbor comes to the door and sees Lizzie standing at the screen door almost as if in a trance. And she's like, Lizzie, what's going on? Is everything okay? Lizzie says, something's happened to Father. So this is when Mrs. Churchill is invited in. And she gets to go and trample to the crime scene, and they discover Mrs. Borden. Then they call for the police. Now, finally, after all this, they're going to go call for the police. The police are at their annual picnic, and there are only 2 officers on duty at the time. So one of the police officers grabs a random man off the street named Charles Sawyer to guard the doors. So Charles is guarding the doors. No police training. People are coming in and out of the house. The crime scene is being messed up. This is something that today would just be like, this would be an absolute no-go. This is destruction of evidence. Nothing in the house would even be admissible. Every piece of evidence would be contaminated. So we go back. Let's see. There are times Lizzie is seen immediately. And at no point does anyone ever say that Lizzie has any blood on her. No blood on Lizzie whatsoever. No one says that. And if this brutal murder was committed in this amount of time, there is no way, and you know how much layering and padding and everything they had to put on, there's no way she would have had time to get redressed either. Even if she did it stark naked, she would not have had time to redress with the corsets and the skirts and the undergarments and everything. She wouldn't have had time to get redressed. And no one states they ever saw blood on Lizzie Borden at any point. Not on her hands, not on her face, not in her hair, and not on her clothing. Next, they did find, when the hatchet was found, in the barn in the barn behind a chimney, and there had been ashes that were dumped on it, so it was already dirty. They find this hatchet. It does have blood and it does have hair on it. However, this hatchet was sent along with that dress that had that one little spot of blood that belonged to Lizzie. This was sent to Dr. Wood at Harvard University, who was basically at the time the CSI department. He knew everything about any kind of forensics at that time. At that time, he determined that not only was that blood that was on her dress menstrual blood, but that the dried blood, and it was dried blood that was found on the hatchet, that the dried blood and the hair on the hatchet, which was the alleged murder weapon, was cow blood and hair of cattle hair. So it wasn't even human.
Okay.
Okay. During the okay, this was the other thing. The doctor finally getting there, Dr. William Doolin, he takes these bodies and puts them up on the table and immediately begins to do a preliminary autopsy right there in the house.
Mm-hmm.
First thought, he was looking for the poisoning that was saying to have been rumored. He found no evidence of poisoning, and based on stomach contents is how we determined that Mrs. Borden passed away first, based on the digestion in her stomach. Now, the people that were left alone in the house with the bodies that night, Bridget, the maid, refuses to stay in the house. She leaves. Emma at that point has returned. Conveniently, Emma returns home that afternoon after traveling. John and Lizzie also stay in the house overnight. Now, at one point, John Morse, during this day, prior to all of these murders happening, he has left again at some point to go and mail letters. And he hires someone to bury Andrew and Abby's bloody clothing. He pays them $5 to bury the victim's clothing. John Morse does this. The police are furious. So, when they start doing the autopsy and everything, he grabs the clothes and pays one of these bystanders $5 to bury the victim's clothing.
That's odd.
Mm-hmm. And at some point in the middle of the night, witnesses, because at this point, this is a big deal. This is a very prominent family in town. People, they said roughly 2,000 people were gathered around the outside of the house, and the house was completely dark until around the wee hours of the morning when someone walked in to where the bodies had been laying out and were covered with a sheet on their table. One small kerosene or whale oil lamp was lit, but they couldn't tell through the windows or anything who it was that was in there with the bodies. Now, also, Mr. Morse had made a point to have an almost unbreakable alibi. Yes, he did go and visit. Yes, he did go about his rounds that morning. Yes, he was seen. Yes, people were willing to testify they were there. However, his alibi was almost too squeaky clean. He not only made a point to know the names of the people on the trolley card that he rode, he also remembered the number that was on the conductor's hat. Now, that is something that if you're just on a trolley car, he was naming out every person on that car, almost as if he was making a point to be seen. This squeaky clean alibi almost seems like he took too much notice of his surroundings.
Sounds pretty well rehearsed.
Very well rehearsed. Now, as Alice Russell, we did say that Alice Russell did testify about, talking about the house being burned down and all that, and about being poisoned. Alice Russell's testimony is flat out hearsay. She's part of the conversation, but there are no other witnesses to the conversation. And as we all know, when people retell the story, sometimes not intentionally, the inflections, the tones, and the words can be altered based on the memory. Eyewitness and ear witness testimony is highly unreliable. So now Lizzie also because she had no attorney present during her inquest, that testimony, as Blake said, had to be completely thrown out. Also, due to her nerves, she was given, let me make sure I get the name of this stuff right. She was given, and this is a very, very, very strong sedative, which I don't believe they give to people anymore. Because she was so distraught at the murder of her parents, she had been given morphine sulfate. And she was on this whenever she gave her inquest testimony. At no point in this day and time would anyone on any kind of medication be allowed to give any kind of testimony on their behalf or for anyone else. So she was kind of grabbed up and said, "Oh, you've got to talk right now." She'd been given medicine. Of course, don't ever think that's straight whenever you're on any kind of medicine like that. Now, also,
especially on morphine.
Morphine, I know. So our guy who has let me get back to this. I've lost my place again, but that's okay. I'm on the super squeaky clean alibi guy. I've already got past him.
Mr. Morse.
Yeah, I'll come back to him in a minute. Professor Wood, There was no stomach contents. I already got that. Blood on the skirt was Mr. Blood. The prosecution, because that they didn't have the murder weapon anymore, because the hatchet had been deemed to have animal blood on it. It was then changed to they had originally said that they didn't know if the killer was right-handed or left-handed. Now they begin to say the killer is right-handed. Well, I don't know. In swinging a hatchet, I guess only the direction you would go would be the indication if you were right or left-handed. But then they tried to say that perhaps it was a meat cleaver. However, no meat cleaver was ever found. No meat cleaver was ever found to have blood on it. So no murder weapon has ever been produced.
I'm saying you've got to be pretty damn strong to do that to a skull with a meat cleaver.
Right. So now.
So I would surmise to say it was probably a hatchet.
And again, let's address Eli Bentz, who is the druggist, who said that Lizzie came in and asked to buy this poison to clean her coat, which he confirmed that she did not buy. So again, that is a non-factor. Can't hold that against her. She didn't actually buy anything. And you can't assume what her motive is, because she said it was to buy something to clean her coat. You can't assume it's something else. This is her statement. He says he didn't sell it. That's a non-factor. Now, let's see. The night before, on August the 3rd, the murders had happened on the 4th. Martha and Marion Shannon, Chagnon, I'm assuming it's French pronounced Shannon, they were the backyard neighbors of the Bordens. And around 11 p.m. on the night of the 3rd, they heard a loud banging on the fence. And it was on the Borden's fence. And it sounded as if someone were climbing over and having a problem getting over the fence. Perhaps they might have been drunk. But they specifically stated to the police that they heard someone disturbing that fence as if they were climbing over it. Charles Gifford saw a drunk man that same night on the doorstep of the Borden household. So perhaps he had gone in, been at the front door, and then he climbed over into the backyard. Uriah Kirby stated that he saw the same man milling about the Borden's property. Mark Chase saw a carriage waiting outside the Borden house at 11 a.m. on the morning of the murders. What this carriage was there for has never been explained. But there was a carriage at 11 a.m., which is about the time that Mr. Borden would have arrived home, but we all know he would have been too cheap to have hired a carriage or pay the livery fees to bring a horse to bring him home. He would have just walked. So why was there a carriage there? Dr. Handy said that the day prior, he had seen an agitated man roaming up and down the street. Now, his testimony, in all fairness, was later changed because he said that he had gotten the day wrong. It was the day prior to that. It was on the 2nd, not on the 3rd. So he did rebuke that, but there is still a man who appeared highly agitated wandering that area.
Has a description of this person ever been given? Because
again, the police were all on a picnic at the time that the murders happened. There were only 2 cops on duty. Now, once it all got around, they all came running back. I have never seen a sketch of these, but these are the people who are on record as giving testimony on behalf of the defense.
So we don't know if they're describing the same person. The people who saw the 2.
We don't know.
Okay.
We don't know. No.
All right.
Now Delia Manti saw at around 10 a.m. the morning of the murders on August the 4th, a man that she did not recognize leaning against the Borden's gate. Strange man, just leaning on the gate. Now, Walter Stevens, he's a good one because Walter Stevens reported, the police said, oh, she couldn't have gone into the barn. We walked in there. We saw no footprints, no dust was disturbed, no whatever. Walter Stevens reported that he had gone into that barn prior to the police arriving as well because he wanted to go. He was one of these reporters. He got there before the police did. He's, trying to figure out what's going on. He goes back into the barn. He said that in that quote, I walked all over it. I wonder why the police didn't see my footprints. Police said they found no prints, and this man says, I got there for the police, and I was looking for the story. There's also Hiram Lemsky, who is a legitimate teamster. He was somebody who, at the time, a teamster was someone who actually took care of the horse teams of horses that would pull carriages. He said that he saw a woman coming out of the barn about the same time that Lizzie said she was coming out of the barn, and that he knew that it wasn't Bridget because he was acquainted with Bridget. So there's someone who puts Lizzie walking out of that barn at the same time.
But he says a woman. If he's acquainted, but if he's acquainted with Bridget, their maid, he's going to be acquainted with the Bordens.
He would not run in the same circle. No. Do you think this guy who literally puts saddles on horses, and if he didn't work for the Bordens, that he would know Lizzie Borden? Do you think he would know? There's a lot of Bordens. They all run the town. That's an assumption you're making. He said he knew who Bridget was. And it was not Bridget. But he did see a woman coming out. You can't assume that it wasn't Lizzie.
Now, did he ever describe the color of the dress she was wearing? Because Lizzie claims she was wearing a blue dress that day. Do we know if he's ever said?
There was nothing in the description, but he did say he saw a woman that was not Bridget coming from the barn at around the same time that Lizzie says that she was there.
Well, it wasn't Lizzie. It's speculation.
Speculation. So now Emma actually did get up and testify. And she testified about the dress. Now, this dress that was allegedly ruined by paint. Emma testified that she is the one who actually told Lizzie to burn the dress. She said the story was that Lizzie had a new dress, had just gotten this new dress, and was so excited to show it to her and Bridget that she had put the dress on, and they had contractors there working at the house and doing repainting, that Alfred had been there and he had painted stuff, and she comes out and carelessly gets paint all over this new dress, fearing that her father is going to be terrified with her. Again, he only gave her enough money for 2 new dresses a year and is going to, chastise her for not paying attention, for not being frugal. Now she's ruined a brand new dress. In order to keep her away from her father's wrath, Emma says, just burn the dress. Just burn the dress. So Lizzie does, because she doesn't want to incur her father's wrath off of having been so careless.
That's a great alibi for an older sister in a motherly role to make up for a younger sister and someone who she helped raise.
She testified under oath. Are you calling Emma Borden a liar?
And people testify under oath all the time and freaking lie and get away with it.
That wasn't my question. That's not my question, sir.
I ain't calling her for supper.
Am I calling? Yeah, right. Am I calling Emma Borden a liar? I'm saying that I find it very, very convenient that after this story comes out that the dress was being burned, all of a sudden, Emma Borden, who had to take on the role of mother to Lizzie, all of a sudden comes up with this protective story about why she would have told her to burn the dress. It's very odd. Very odd. I'm just going to say it's very odd.
It is odd. I also find it odd that John Morse had him bury the victim's clothing.
That is really fucking odd. Yeah.
So, in summation, her testimony in her inquest was thrown out for good reason. She was on morphine sulfate. She had no counsel present to advise her. The dress was burned. We have a reason for that. She was told to by her older sister, who was a motherly figure, who would have done what her sister told her to do. For a girl her size, this was not a girl who was used to wielding a hatchet. This was as prim and proper as she possibly could be. No. She was never known to be a field hand. No. This is not a girl.
She doesn't have to be a field hand to wield a hatchet. She could go out there and kill. She could go out there and kill some of the pigeons in the barn that now make it onto their table.
That's true.
Killing a pigeon is much different than wielding enough force in your arms to go through a skull of a human being.
You got a lot of rage. You can do a lot of things.
That is speculation, sir.
You're speculating because you're saying you don't know how she didn't know how to use it.
I didn't say she didn't know how to use it. I'm saying that this is not a girl who on a daily basis used a hatchet.
I don't.
Did anyone? No one ever looked at her hands. I mean, if you swung that hatchet that many times and were not used to it and had dainty, delicate hands that were supposed to be doing needlework and working for the church.
I don't know how to use I use an axe usually whenever I'm chopping wood. I don't know how to use a hatchet either. But if I picked one up and looked at it and said, I want to kill somebody with this, and I can go for their head right here, anything like that, I would know how much force to freaking use to be able to render somebody unconscious.
I think I'd have to swing it a few times to know how much force. I'm telling you, this is not something she used on a daily basis. She was not a field hand. She worked for the church.
You just said I would have to.
I don't use an axe every day, but I can split wood.
Yeah, I'm not saying, and you just said I would have to swing it a few times. Well, we know there were multiple strikes, but whatever the murder weapon was to both of the parents, so maybe she did swing it a few times before she got the hang of it, and then killed him.
But they say that Mr. Borden was killed by the second blow. I believe that is what the prosecution said.
But he was also the second one killed.
You can't have it both ways.
You're also not accounting for adrenaline.
What do you mean I can't have it both ways? He was the second one killed. He was killed by the second blow. So when Mrs. Borden was killed, we knew she was hit many more times than Mr. Borden was killed. Than Mr. Borden was when he was killed.
So wouldn't that be your adrenaline spike? And after you have a big spike of adrenaline, wouldn't you be tired?
I mean, she just could have gotten the hang
ready
of it
to do it again.
Yeah, I'm saying she just could have gotten the hang of it on the second blow.
Okay, here's my whole thing. Number one, all the people who...
Can I finish? Oh, yeah,
go for it. Go for it.
Multiple witnesses say that there were other people that were likely or could have been possibly, other than Lizzie. Witnesses have given you other people, including John Morse, who allegedly at one point was having an affair with Bridget. Allegedly. I found that in two different articles that it was speculated that he was actually having an affair with Bridget. So, and remember, Bridget was very disrespected in this household. There is absolutely zero blood evidence linking Lizzie to the crime. Not on her dress, not on her body, not on her face, and not in her hair. There also, the hatchet, animal blood, animal hair. And as far as the police saying that how she acted didn't seem right in the moment, she was in shock. People act lots of different ways. You can't tell me how to behave. You tell me how you behaved after you killed your parents, and then we can compare. But being is that he didn't know how someone who had just killed their parents allegedly would behave, or just found their parents dead would allegedly behave. That's all speculation. You can't tell. You can never determine how someone's going to behave in a situation. So therefore, with a complete and total lack of evidence from the prosecution, you have a very thin circumstantial case at best. You have to find her not guilty.
Well, then who do you surmise did it then?
I don't have to tell you. I just have to create reasonable doubt. And there's beyond a reasonable doubt that she is innocent. I do not have to give you.
So I will say,
how the justice system works. I don't have to give you another suspect. I just have to create reasonable doubt.
Hold your horses, okay? Back it up a little bit.
The defense rests.
What I'm saying is I do believe that there are reasons on both sides that could point to maybe she did do it and maybe she didn't do it. Because the whole burying of the bloody clothes, that's really fucking weird. I will say that.
I would say, number one, all the people that are seen around the house and all this stuff can go out the window because nobody ever says that they saw anybody go in or come out of the house. That's number one. Number two, if it is a passerby, you're going to tell me that a passerby goes in, kills Mrs. Borden at around 9:30, waits and hides either in the house or comes back without being seen to kill Mr. Borden at 11 o'clock. Bullshit number two.
Actually,
and at the same time, Mrs. Borden is struck on the face. We know that she's alive after the first blow because she has bruising on the bridge of her nose, bruising on her forehead. She falls and hits the ground. Dead weight on the second floor. And Lizzie hears nothing after she receives 18 blows to the back of the head. She still hears nothing. Lizzie is supposedly outside in the barn whenever Mr. Borden is murdered. However, I'm going to go on the fact of her not being able to use a hatchet or wield a hatchet Number one, she strikes somebody right here. The first blow is right here. It's at the temple, which is, I mean, you're going to knock somebody unconscious if you're yielding it with the entire force. Mr. Borden is all to the left side of the face. You're going to knock him unconscious. I mean, he's already sleeping as it is. He's killed in his sleep. There's no fight back. There's no struggle. I'm not going to sit here and trying to give you an explanation about how the fuck there is no blood other than she could have used something to cover as she was doing it, or worn something that she could easily have pulled off. Gloves or anything that she could have just stashed somewhere really fast, flipped off or whatnot, and been blood free at that point. I just don't see.
So let me give you a timeline thing here. So
Okay.
I did find something that it's alleged that Lizzie had a boyfriend.
Okay.
And that Mr. Borden did not approve because he didn't have enough money.
Okay.
And it has been alleged that, well, Lizzie had told someone at some point in one of these ones that I read that her boyfriend actually had killed Mrs. Borden, and he told Lizzie to go and wait in the barn until he called for her. And they were going to run away together, and unfortunately, Mr. Borden came home. He kills him. He gets the hell out of there because that wasn't part of the plan. And Lizzie hears the moan. She comes back in, sees her father, flips out. That wasn't part of the plan.
I don't buy the boyfriend tactic because where the
Mhm.
hell is he after she's acquitted?
Oh, child, if you got away, wouldn't you want to stay away? Because now they're still looking for the murderer.
Yeah, but I mean, if it's her boyfriend and they're gonna run away, they're madly in love.
I guess he wasn't that in love. That's just another theory that I
Yeah.
found out there.
Yeah.
That she had at one
Ain't
point
buying
said
it.
that she had a father. Her father did not approve of her boyfriend at the time,
Mhm.
and just hated him. He didn't have enough money. He wasn't good enough for her. Da, 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 da. And
Here-
being that she was 32, this was probably not an uncommon theme. Being that she's 32 and never married, but her father was wealthy. There should have been people lining up to marry her, if nothing more than for the social status.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is what I'll say, and I think personally, and I'm going to say what I think personally, and then I want to say what I think from a legal standpoint. After I say this, I think personally that she did do it, or knows who did it, but with the lack of a murder weapon, with the lack of the blood, and with also her being on morphine when giving her testimony and having no representation, I see why they let her off. Oh, what you got?
How Lizzie Borden got away with it?
Holy shit!
Let's go.
All right.
There's a bunch of things that play into her trial. Number one, nativism. Number two, gender stereotypes, wealth, culture, religion, class, and ethnicity. And yes, I'm reading from my notes because I don't want to forget one single thing. All played a
Okay.
part into not only what took place immediately after the murders, but also in securing acquittal for Lizzie Borden. I will tell you, this is not coming from an article. These are just type notes of my own words.
Okay.
So, nativism, or the policy of protecting the interests of native-born against those of immigrants, is running rampant at this time in U.S. history, particularly against the Irish immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
We see this in the name Maggie, that the Borden girls call Bridget Sullivan. We see Lizzie wanting to move away from the current neighborhood to the Hill. The neighborhood where they were living was becoming increasingly dominated by Catholic immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
This case quickly became a flashpoint in the Irish insurgency in the city. The composition of the police force combined with the election of the city's second Irish mayor were all pieces of a challenge to native-born control. And when questioned about the murders, Lizzie was not used to being held to account by those that she considered beneath her. I'm talking about her trial. I'm not talking about the murders, how she did it, how she didn't do it. I'm talking about how she got acquitted. So we also see nativism rearing its ugly head when Lizzie sent Bridget Sullivan to native-born Dr. Bowen's home to collect him. She didn't send her next door to the neighbor's house, that of Irish immigrant Dr. Michael Kelly, whose impressive educational background helped him to serve as Fall River City's physician. And other sources state that she didn't seek the help of French-Canadian doctor who lived diagonally behind the Bordens either. So it's no wonder also that that's why we have the first suspect is the Portuguese laborer that's being arrested. So then you look at the gender stereotypes, wealth, culture, religion, class, and ethnicity as the other reasons why she was able to get away with it. Lizzie's legion of supporters was unable to consider what they saw as culturally inconceivable. A well-bred, virtuous Victorian woman, a Protestant nun, quote unquote, as the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union put it, could never commit patricide. The label of Protestant nun defined a, quote, true woman as morally pure, physically delicate, and socially respectable. This caused her supporters to rally behind her and say that she wouldn't be judged by a jury of her peers because women, as non-voters, did not have the right to serve on juries. Though it makes you wonder if she would have been convicted if it had been an all-female jury. So kind of careful what you wish for thing. Now here's your gender paradox, if you will, of Lizzie's trial. Lizzie by no means was a helpless woman. She just needed to appear as one. That was it.
Mm-hmm.
Her lawyers told her to dress in black, and she appeared in court tightly corseted, dressed in flowing clothes, holding a bouquet of flowers in one hand and a fan in the other. Newspapers described her as a quiet, modest, and well-bred person or woman. And another stressed that she lacked, quote, Amazonian proportions, that she could not possess the physical strength, let alone the moral degeneracy, to wield a weapon with skull-cracking force, which is a very far cry from the, quote, brawny, big, muscular, hard-faced, coarse-looking girl, end quote, as previously stated in newspapers before her trial. Add in her father's wealth that allowed her to have the best representation money could afford, including a former Massachusetts governor who appointed one of the three judges on the panel, and you have the perfect storm for a believable story of how this woman could not commit these crimes. And also add in the fact of the missing pieces of the evidence, as well as the prosecution failing to meet the burden of proof of unreasonable doubt, and boom, you have an acquittal. Obviously, that last part, yes, I know, is being the most important, but it's not to say that it would not have been easy for Lizzie to get away with this, because at this time, Lizzie was seen as this delicate flower, which she wasn't. Newspapers described her as big and brawny and muscular and all of this stuff. She wasn't this helpless, feigning, delicate woman that she appeared to be in court. She would have had the strength based on physical attributes that newspapers give her in previous articles to possibly swing a hatchet with skull-cracking force. What we're going off of is what she is perceived to be at the trial. And we all know that the defense goes in, and it's not just about the defense statements, but it's also how you appear.
Mm-hmm.
And back
Every
then,
good lawyer coaches their client.
and back
what to
then,
say, what to do.
When a woman, that this was so unconceivable that a woman could do this, of course, we need to make her look as delicate as possible. That's how Lizzie Borden got the acquittal for her trial.
Plus, they found no murder weapon. There was no blood on her, and they had no evidence against her.
Mm-hmm.
That's how she got an acquittal as well.
Yeah. I think it all, but both are true. Yes.
I think,
but I would say too,
I don't know.
She comes from a place of wealth and a place of privilege. You can pay off anybody she wanted to.
Of course.
My whole thing is, if this time frame and this window of opportunity was that small, it is inconceivable to me as to how she would have no blood on her and dispose, if she did wear a covering, dispose of the covering and the murder weapon. And when the police get there, and you got to remember, the second this starts happening, there are people trampling in there. She's inviting people in. Where is her opportunity to get rid of that weapon?
Not necessarily, because that's another hang up that I have with it. Because after so quickly finding her father dead, not realizing that her mother is dead, we're talking about an 8 to 13 minute window here. Mm-hmm. He comes home, boom, she finds him dead. Oh my God, Maggie, come down quick. I need a doctor. Father is dead. Go get the doctor. Well, he's not there. We'll go next door. Why is she so fast to send Bridget off to A, get the doctor, B, get the neighbor, and all this stuff without fear that she would be next? How does she not know that the axe murderer is not still inside the house after just finding her father? Why is she the only one that is so comfortable being in there by herself?
You could chalk it up to shock.
She is. No, because if I walked into a freaking murder scene where somebody's head was crushed in with a freaking axe, yeah, I'd be shocked, but I'm gonna back out. I don't
Like,
know.
I don't think
I
you
don't
know
know.
for
Like
sure
I
how
said,
you'd react.
she has the motive, she has the wealth, she has the power. Do I think that she used all of those to her advantage? And do I think that she had the motive to kill her father? Yes. Do I think she did it? Yes. But
Means, motive, and opportunity.
absolutely. However, because there is a lack of evidence, I think that's why she got acquitted.
What doesn't make sense to me is I just don't really think that she had sufficient time to hide or remove if there was
We
the murder weapon and whatever it was that she potentially would have covered herself or if she was naked to redress. I
Mhm.
don't see how she would have gotten that far enough off the property in the amount of time because the second Bridget leaves the house, she starts screaming that, hey, we need a doctor, and people begin to form outside the house. I don't see how she would have legitimately had time to get rid of the murder weapon. And so the police couldn't find it.
You have no idea what secret compartments she would have had. You said yourself that she was a complete homebody. She could have made something in the floorboard of the
That's an assumption.
Or also, here's $50. You didn't see anything. You can look the other way to the cops or whoever's looking through the home.
She wasn't known to carry a lot of money though. So again, it was her father that was wealthy, not her.
Well, she may have known where the money was
But
kept.
also, here's the thing: is we don't have timestamps of when
Yeah.
Bridget left the house and Bridget
Mhm.
came back from Dr. Bowen's, and
These
then
are all
Bridget
estimated time frames.
and then
yes.
Bridget leaves the house again and goes to the neighbor's house and come back. We don't have timestamps of her coming and going. How do we know that there's not an entire hour that passes? All she's got to do is make it to the piece of property where there's a well at or something and toss it down in there or something so that they're not going to go search the well, or go down to the cellar and put it in the cellar somewhere that's underground or in the double latrine toilet that they had down there. Ain't nobody going to be looking up in that bitch.
Mhm.
At least I'm
Well,
not.
I will let you know that Stanford University did do a mock trial where they retried Lizzie Borden.
Okay.
And after much deliberation, she again was acquitted based on evidence and reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Due to the fact that Mr. Borden did have so many enemies, and due to the fact that he and who they speculated was potentially the main, if it wasn't Lizzie Borden, potentially the main suspect would have been John Morse, because he had come in because he and Andrew had been quarreling over money.
Mhm.
And the next day, Andrew Borden is dead, and he has just too squeaky of an alibi, and he's paying people to bury the deceased clothes as soon as they're taken off of them. And he's like, oh, yes, so and so and so and so and so and so. They were all in the trolley. The conductor's number on his shirt was 14041 or da da da. He has everything so in place, which, interestingly enough, so does Bridget. And at the same time, he is alleged to potentially have been having, again, two different places I found he was alleged to have been having an affair with Bridget. So he, to me, lines up as the most likely suspect. But again, because we don't have the timestamps on everything, and he would have been able to get in the house and Bridget could have let him in.
So do we think they worked in concert with each other?
Potentially. Who else stood to inherit the money besides Lizzie? And besides Emma?
She wanted to live in a modern home. She wanted to get out of the neighborhood she was in. She wanted to live on the hill.
Means, motive, opportunity.
Mhm.
Yes, but who's also
And what I'm saying,
John Morse, who had business dealings with Andrew, he would have received all of Andrew's business holdings. There is not one person who's motivated by money. There are multiple.
Oh no.
Yeah.
So, I think this is the reason why this case still goes unsolved. I mean, we don't know timestamps of how Lizzie may have or may not have killed her parent. Not timestamps. Anyways, I'm getting my words mixed up. Sorry. We don't have the ways of knowing how she may or may not have done it. If she did it, what does she cover herself if she did? She changed clothes. What's the timestamps of the May going up? Blah blah blah. We don't have all of that. So, and we also don't have a murder weapon. So I think that this case will go on to remain unsolved for eternity. It's already been unsolved in 130 years, and I don't think it's going to be solved anytime soon.
Y'all, this is just like Who Shot JR? So many enemies, lots of suspects.
That's all right.
But this one doesn't end with Patrick
But-
Duffy in a shower. So
Thank God.
But we would like to hear y'all's comments. So if you want to tell us how you think Lizzie
just
would
put-
or would not or would have done it.
Guilty or not guilty, maybe in the comments.
Oh no, I like to
Based
hear
on what
people's
you heard.
stories.
Oh yeah, if you got a theory, put that theory.
You got a
out
theory,
there.
put that theory in there about how you think she
Yeah.
would have
But
gotten
if you're
away
gonna
with it. If
vote,
it's a
vote
good
based
enough
on
one.
evidence.
If it's a good enough one, we may revisit that. Who knows? Well, we hope y'all have enjoyed this episode of Everything Vaguely Paranormal. We thank y'all for joining us. And remember, whatever social media channel you are watching us on, we are not just on that social media channel. We are on all social media channels. That would be Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. So make sure you go follow us across the board because we don't use every page for everything. We use them all for different reasons. Also, we only have like 4 tickets left for the next Longview Museum on October the 22nd on that Saturday. So make sure if you want to join us on that to go and get your ticket because they will be sold out so fast.
Going
And
quick.
it's going to be a good one. I'm telling you right now, it's going to be good.
Mhm.
And also be on the lookout later this week. We might be dropping some interesting trailers that you might want to pay attention to. Hint, hint. Watch the Facebook page.
So excited.
Wink, wink.
Wink,
Nod,
wink.
Nudge, nudge.
Shelly, what
And
else
if
can
you
they
want to
do?
know what we really talk about, if you want to know what trailer we're talking about, Patreon members already know. They already know. So you should become a Patreon member if you want to know what we really talk about. It's $5 a month. There's no tiers. We don't nickel and dime you for $5. You get everything, all of our pre-broadcast, all of our special Paracon stuff and things like that. $5 a month. And if you want to know how our investigation at Old Park went this past weekend, child, we just talked on it
Y'all.
about it on tonight's pre-broadcast. What else I need to know, Ryan?
So go to anywhere you get your podcast. Please rate and review us. Please share us as much as you can. Please tell 2 people, have those people tell 2 people, because the more we get, the bigger and better we can be, and the more we can do for you guys. Also, I don't know if you noticed my hat. It's an EVP hat. It's a stylish new
We
new
have
addition
merch.
to our fashion line. If
That
you
is
would like
something.
one for yourself, $25. And Shelly, how can they get that?
They can email the EVP pod, the EVP pod at gmail.com, and let me know. Like, share, and subscribe for everything.
Absolutely. Well, y'all, my name is Blake Smith from my partners in the paranormal, Miss Shelley Pruitt and Mr. Ryan Roberts. We thank y'all so much for joining us. And as always, we will
We'll
see you next
Tuesday.
Tuesday. Bye, y'all.
Bye.